All right, we are live. Thanks everyone for joining us today. It's going to be a great discussion. Today we will be talking with Dr. Andrew Thomas about his book, Iran and the West, a non-Western approach to foreign policy. It's going to be a great conversation. We've done a lot on foreign policy, but not particularly this topic. So I'm really excited to have him on today. For those of you who might be new to the project, the goal of the Iran 1400 project is to encourage healthy and productive conversations about Iran that make a constructive contribution to the understanding of the country. We are confident that today's conversation will be a valuable resource in that mission. And Dr. Thomas, on behalf of the advisory board and the team at Iran 1400 Project, we thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule and for waking up early and joining us from Australia to be with us today. The Iran 1400 Project's mission is to foster a greater understanding of Iran's history during the past century in order to promote an informed conversation about Iran's future. Your book's insightful observations and analysis of Iran's foreign policy through a non-Western lens will certainly contribute to that goal. It is a great privilege to have you here today and to benefit from your expertise. So for those who don't know, Dr. Andrew Thomas is a lecturer in Middle East Studies and International Relations at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia. He specializes in critical non-Western international relations theory and counter-hegemonic perspectives. He is also interested in sanctions policy in the Middle East, particularly in Iran and Syria. And like I mentioned earlier, he is joining us, I believe, 7 a.m. in his time. So we really appreciate you being here with us. And accommodating us who are based in the US or the UK who are joining in for listening. It's our first event with someone from Australia. So it's a pleasure. One last thing before you can begin, Dr. Thomas. For those in the audience, today's format will be 30 minutes of listening to Dr. Thomas discuss his book, and then this will be followed by around another 30 minutes for a Q&A. You can send those questions in at any time, and we will get to them. And you can just post those questions into the Zoom chat, and I will add them to our queue. And without further ado, Dr. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sydney. And yes, it is quite early. Me and my colleagues sometimes joke that academics don't know that time exists before 10 a.m. So 7 a.m. is quite early, but this was such a big opportunity, and thank you, Sydney and Iran 1400 for having me. It's truly an honor to be part of this independent movement, to make a constructive contribution to understanding Iran. After all, that is kind of what the book is about. It doesn't give any really definitive answers. Unfortunately, people may be looking for certain outcomes in this book that simply aren't there. Really, this is an exploration. It is an attempt to sort of, as you might tell, I'm not Persian, I'm not Iranian, but it is a way of sort of building a framework for all scholars to draw on contexts beyond their own, as ways of improving their analysis and adding nuance back into their analysis. Now, the discussion is, there's a lot of international relations talk in this discussion, primarily because, as Sydney and I were speaking about before we started here, there may be a lot of people who don't know much about international politics and sort of the origins of it, or really what it is. It's actually quite a cognate field. It's something that has these sort of constructed boundaries, and what it looks at, what it doesn't look at. So we will talk about that. But essentially what I'm trying to get at is, at least I hope, the thrust of this book, or the original thrust of it, Iran and the West, is kind of the same as Iran 1400. It's designed to sort of draw in more nuance, more more understanding to the Iranian case. So since my undergrad studies, this is going back a little while, I've always been frustrated with the way that the field of international relations, or we call it IR, views the Middle East and by extension Iran. That's something that isn't necessarily unique to the Middle East either. It views Africa, views Latin America, it views Asia, kind of all the same way by design. I start the book by saying that academic explorations in any field are often haunted by the origins of the field itself, where the field began. And sometimes it's not so easy to figure out where that field began, something like dance, for example. It's difficult to sort of pinpoint where that activity began. International relations is actually very, very easy to see where that field began, and it began squarely in Europe in the 15th century through the Treaty of Westphalia, through between European nations, and in adding to that context, it began in colonial Europe. So Europe that was colonizing other states, exploiting their resources, exploiting their human beings as well, to a point where international relations and European relations for a long time, for a very long time, were essentially the same thing. So, for example, relations with China in the colonial European times, they weren't really seen as international relations. They were seen as relations with a non-state, a culture outside of Europe. So, in a sense, the Europeanness, if you will, of international relations isn't a problem unto itself, and certainly not a unique problem to this field of study, really. But by continually using the same frames of reference and validating the same ideas, mainstream international relations, or what many call mainstream IR, which some of you would be referred to, would know or have heard of approaches like realism, neo-realism, liberal internationalism, and even the English School of International Relations to a certain extent. These sort of Western frameworks of analysis have become by far the dominant approach in international relations, and particularly neo-realism has become the dominant approach in what we would call security studies. So dealing with militaries, dealing with potential threats to national security, dealing with borders, etc. But for example, realist analysis tells us that it is only survival in the condition of anarchy that motivates states, and that other factors are essentially redundant. So when we talk about anarchy in international politics, for those who don't know, that essentially means that there's no world government. We have the UN, but we don't have effective enforcement, as we've seen in recent months. That violations of sovereignty or potential war crimes can't be adjudicated in an objective way that is managed through the same way that it's managed through states, which is through checks and balances and institutions. There are no independent institutions in international relations. So that, or at least international organizations that have any power to do anything. So it doesn't matter to realists which system of government a state has, the nature of its domestic politics, and especially, this is key to this book, not its conditions of identity. It will always act within the confines of a cost-benefit analysis relating to its own survival. Similarly, liberal internationalism attempts to distance itself from its European origins. Again, not a problem in itself. I think a lot of us agree that universal human rights are a concept that's benefited billions of people, millions of people, but they are applied pretty unevenly. And that is a sore spot with a lot of critics of liberal internationalism. But the European origins of liberal human rights, democracy, and its specific forms of mandatory politics are again not a problem unto themselves, but liberal actors often forego these principles in favor of preserving what we would call a liberal order. So an order that serves certain interests. And again, liberalism is supposed to be about humanity, supposed to be about emancipation, supposed to be about equality. Now, this is not to say, I'm not trying to tear down mainstream IR here. Mainstream approaches to IR are not counterproductive to analysis. They've been instrumental in making our world and politics make sense over the last century, particularly since the First World War. And, thanks to liberal internationalism, we have institutions like the United Nations. And thanks to realism, we have pragmatic policy analysis in war, for example. These are important concepts, and these are things that I'm not arguing against. But as IR becomes more about context beyond the West, which it has been doing for a long time now, we can see this is a little bit of a problem. The more mainstream IR is canonized, which is a word that a lot of some of the scholars that I'm referring to use. So basically made like scripture and verse. And as like empirical knowledge, how many times have you guys heard the word political science? That really encapsulates how a lot of IR scholars see international relations. They see it more like a natural science in some ways. But while that can be helpful and often correct and often lead to positive policy outcomes, the more it does mean that more native and non-Western perspectives are essentially pushed to the periphery of any discourse on the issue. Of course, me as an early career scholar from Australia, having a Western understanding of the world, having a Western undergraduate degree, I am definitely not the first person to notice this. Amazing scholars like Robbie Shillian, Amitav Arkaya, Barry Buzan, Amy Yang, Arlene Tickner, Ollie Waver, LHM Ling, for example, have all reckoned with this lack of consideration of native non-Western scholarship in our field, essentially head on. Ling, in her fantastic book, The Tao of World Politics, calls the hegemonic status of our Westphalian world, referring to the original Treaty of Westphalia and the construction of the state as being an inherently Western thing. And she says it discounts the knowledge of multiple worlds, the idea that there are multiple ways to view the world and its way of knowing. Even as Westphalia world routinely benefits from the knowledge of these multiple worlds. Now, you might be thinking, once again, and understandably so, what is an Australian academic with a Western IR education attempting to undertake exploration into non-Western IR? Well, non-Western perspectives aren't considered by the broader academy for actually quite a few good reasons. Non-Western perspectives can and are scattered, contradictory a lot of the time, or even inaccessible thanks to language and other barriers. So, for example, unlike Sydney, I cannot speak or read Farsi, and that's a significant barrier to a lot of work in Iran. Because of this, what happens is that Western scholars deliberately shy away from considering native and non-Western perspectives. They self-exclude themselves from looking and drawing on these scholars, assuming that there are no sources in English, assuming that there are no perspectives that are actually accessible to them that might be helpful. And my view is that we owe it to ourselves to attempt to draw out thought in cultures beyond our own and on our own when and where we can, in order to bring historical, cultural, and epistemic nuance to our field. Non-Western scholarship should be acknowledged and to the disposal of all scholars. That is essentially the kind of, shall we say, ideological thrust of the book. And the idea is that this is applicable in any context, ideally. It could be applicable in an African or Latin American context, or even Eastern European context. where scholars basically say, well, that's not my place to study. Now, of course, Western scholars have to be extremely careful not to be reductive, but I feel like this book gives a framework for scholars to do just that, to not be reductive. So this essentially brings us to the case of Iran. I've been fascinated with Iran since my undergrad. The history of it, the way in which the structure of the Islamic Republic in particular has been something that has been very interesting. The factional politics within that, the IRGC, the Guardian Council, the Supreme Leader himself, all of it I've found incredibly interesting. The realpolitik view, or the realist view of Iran in foreign policy terms, is something that could be familiar to actually quite a lot of us, not necessarily through reading academic texts, but from watching defense secretary press releases, watching US presidential addresses, and even communicating directly to the public about Iran. US senators talking about it on the Senate floor, and even to the press. Potentially in newspaper op-eds as well, magazines, New York Times, Foreign Policy, whatever. The first example I bring up in the book is actually from the Congressional Research Service reports on Iran. So the Congressional Research Service reports play an important role in American politics. As many of you know, a lot of senators don't know a lot about stuff. So there's essentially the researchers in the Library of Congress are contracted to basically provide summaries on certain contexts. A lot of these are freely available. The ones that aren't classified certainly are. And the ones on Iran as a kind of a country profile are definitely available for all of us to read. They're quite interesting, and they are very high quality and well researched, by the way. Again, this is not something that is not having a go at any of these researchers who are doing this work. This is very good work. Though their purpose is sometimes not to give nuance to discussion. That's what we need to understand. Where we're looking at a congressional context, we're looking at a national interest context. We're looking at elected representatives protecting the interests of the United States. And that's where these papers are written. This is the context in which these papers are written. So, and particularly when it comes to an adversary of the United States, they are going to be written in a certain way. So in the 2014 CRS report entitled Iran, US Concerns and Policy Responses, Iran's foreign policy is described as a product of ideology of Iran's Islamic Revolution, blended with long-standing national interests and exhibiting elements of pragmatism. Now, sounds like fairly neutral language, but phrases like this are common in all adversarial foreign policy contexts. But for our purpose, raise a couple of concerns, essentially about whether or not this is illustrative of Iran's foreign policy. Firstly, the statement defines Iranian foreign policy in terms of a point of deviation from a cooperative relationship with the West. The Islamic Revolution, essentially. That is the defining moment of Iran's relationship with the United States. This effectively ignores any and all context prior to the revolution, including the 1951 coup orchestrated by the UK and the US, overthrowing Mohammad Mossadegh. Secondly, the term national interest, which again is something that is said probably 2 times every sentence in realist international relations, is used to describe Iran's motivations. And it's a term that's commonly used within the classical realist and neo-realist traditions of IR. It's universally applied as a motivator for all states. It's very rarely explained, though, in terms of each context. This is where we assume that the motivations of all states are effectively the same. They all boil down to the same thing. And essentially that our definitions of survival in an anarchic system are all the same. All states want to survive in the same way and under the same condition. Finally, the statement finishes by saying that Iran exhibits elements of pragmatic foreign policy, implying, and this is the part that really grinds my gears, implying that Iranian foreign policy is for the most part unpragmatic. So basically, it is effectively saying, well, it kind of understands the way the world works, but doesn't really. And really, what it is actually saying is that it doesn't understand the world on our terms, doesn't understand the world on the US's terms. It also alludes to the idea that pragmatism is an analytical term, is a descriptor, objectively defined by cooperating with the predefined rules and congruence with positive, quote unquote, characteristics. These characteristics include accepting the current international order as just and not resisting against it. While it's a short statement, and clearly for the consumption of policymakers in an adversarial context, the perspective of Iran as a monolithic ideological and theocratic force is common in security and international relations discussions. Given that a lot of policy and academic writing is like this, I felt Iran was an ideal case study, essentially, to do this non-Western investigation. Add to that, the fact that Iran's history holds many encounters with the West. The Iranian state, which many would call a revisionist state, has a very different relationship to the current world order and its Western counterparts than its Western counterparts. While Iran was never a formal colony of the West, its people have undoubtedly had a colonial experience with the West. For example, in the constitutional crisis, through the operations of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and the United Kingdom's position on that, and of course the 1951 coup. The Iranian state has also, this is really important, effectively institutionalized a resistance against the West since the 1979 resolution. That resistance is a part of the state. That resistance is part of its interests. And that is something that is very unfamiliar to a lot of Western states. Also, there is a lot of international relations scholarship coming out of Iran or from Iranian expats in English that is of excellent quality. So, for example, Kamran Martin, who has been on Iran 1400 before, Homira Moshilzadeh, Farid Maghribi, Ziba Mir Husseini, Ali Ansari, all these scholars have really providing excellent perspectives on Iran, nuanced perspectives on Iran in English. So Iran, as well, topping off, is that Iran is frequently at the topic of mainstream international politics and in the media and in the public discourse. So all of these things combined have kind of motivated this study. So given the clear existence of non-Western perspectives from and about Iran, the aim of the book is to draw out and critically explore these understandings about Iran's relationship with the Western world, illustrating their value to theory, policy analysis, and experts on Iranian politics. I do this by effectively asking a few questions. How do Iranian perspectives on important contemporary interactions with the West differ from the majority of Western accounts? And does examination of chosen case study snapshots, considering non-Western perspectives, alter how these events are perceived? So part of the way that I structure the book is looking at 4 case studies, and we'll go through those in a moment. A really important one is, as the author has no practical knowledge of a language other than English, how accessible are non-Western perspectives due to the scholar's language limitations? And this is important in terms of replicating this study for anybody, for people who are just interested in Iran, for people who want to explore it, but don't want to come out the other end with an Orientalist perspective or have a condescending attitude to their study. These are obviously quite open questions, and they are more about encouraging exploration than finding definitive conclusions. But I think the book shows the value of consciously, as a kind of conscious effort, for drawing on Iranian scholarship when conducting international relations analysis, especially where scholars or analysts have little connection to Iran beyond their specific studies. for Iranian perspectives to be engaged in a manner that they truly deserve to be in international relations, academics with Western backgrounds must be encouraged to conduct studies that advocate for these methods of analysis. Also, an entirely Iranian perspective is not necessarily more helpful than an entirely Western one, and when it comes to examining the relationship between Iran and the West. In fact, quite often, if we're looking at, say, for example, discourse coming out of the States, that can be entirely unhelpful, very unhelpful, in fact, as we know quite often. There are quite a lot of common themes when we're looking at the sort of Iranian scholarship on encounters with the West. There are quite a lot of common themes in this analysis. Of course, identity is quite a big one. So Persian nationalism and heritage. So looking back at all the Persian kings and Shah Nameh and the origins of Farsi, etc. The framing of competing national identities, whether they be Persian or Shia Islam or whatever, or in some cases, Kurdish and Zoroastrian as well. All these different competing and sort of very, very often very old identities that often come up in contemporary analysis of Iran. And also debates and critiques surrounding Shiism and political Islam in politics. Obviously, the ideas of Khomeini and Khomeiniism, Ali Shariati, Abdul Karim Saroush, Taqi Mizbayazi, all these really important figures in political Islam, and potentially one of the more interesting elements of this kind of context, and one of the reasons why I started the study back in my PhD studies, was that there was a lack of understanding of the sort of debates on Islam, political Islam within the country, and it sort of was seen as this kind of monolithic, sort of the mullahs are just one sort of ideological framework of communism. There have been several encounters that a lot of people know where those the authority of the jurisconsult has been very significantly tested politically. Post-colonialism as a theoretical framework. A lot of people who study literature might be familiar with post-colonialism. It's also a framework of international relations inquiry, and is effectively a critique of power relations from the colonial era. So not about a time period per se, but about a legacy of that time. So we use that. A lot of Iranian scholars use that lens to look at sanctions policy, look at rhetoric of elites, particularly in the West, and look at Khomeiniism as resistance, as a post-colonial unleashing on the West. Also, the writings of Jalal Ali Ahmad and this concept of Gabzadegi, I always struggle with that word, that concept of sort of toxic Western infection of Iran is definitely this kind of post-colonial perspective. Related to this is resistance to the Western global order. Now, often this is state-affirming and pro-authoritarian. A lot of these discourses can be used by the regime to prop it up, used by the Islamic Republic to kind of consolidate its power. We see this in the sanctions chapter for sure. And it has incorporations of mainstream IR in power balancing, sort of looking at ways in which Iran, with its relatively little power compared to a state like the United States or the European Union, can throw its weight, around without, for example, being a superpower. That's one way. So that informs a lot of its actions with proxy armies, for example. Norm entrepreneurship or antipreneurship. This is a concept that basically looks at using norms and changing them in international relations so that they benefit Iran. Arguably, one way they did this actually with the help of the United States, was with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal, where there was a framework for dealing with states that were proliferating nuclear weapons called the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and Iran didn't really cooperate with that. But by doing so, they created another framework that they were happy with, which was the JCPOA. And then, of course, the IRGC as an arbiter of resistance, as this faction that is kind of sometimes undermines other leaders, other factions in Iran, in showing that trying to push this resistance narrative. Of course, democracy and liberalism, as we've seen in the last couple of years after the death of Mahsa Amini, has been a really important narrative as well. And even today, Iranians go to the polls to elect a new parliament. So Shia Islam and democracy, and sort of that reconciling these two elements. Again, this is one of the wider discussions in Iranian scholarship about what role Islam should play. It isn't all communism and liberal democracy. There is a lot in between. There's a lot of scholarship that advocates for, particularly a lot of reformist scholarship that talks about how Islam can and should play an essential role in a reformed democratic Iran. Obviously, civil liberties and emancipation, factional politics and political will. All of this stuff is really important in the scholarship as well. Reconciliation with the West and civilizational dialogue. So, as we know, the pendulum often swings between Iran being staunchly anti-Western and wanting some kind of détente with the West. So the pin-up or the poster child for this is Mohammad Khatami and the dialogue of civilizations. There's actually a whole chapter in the book dedicated to this. Because there is a big kind of discursive framing of the book as well. And then, of course, the JCPOA is the other big sort of reconciliation with the West. So in light of these themes, I explore 4 case studies in an attempt to draw out Iranian perspectives. So the first is Khatami's efforts at reconciliation with the West and the axis of evil metaphor. So this covers much of the presidency of Mohammad Khatami and his attempt at détente with the West. Given the September 11 attacks consumed foreign policy analysis at the time, US relations with Iran were not under much investigation. However, overtures of reconciliation framed through identity had a clear catalytic effect on relations between Iran and the West in this period, coinciding with an attempt on the part of President Mohammad Khatami to push Iran in a new policy direction, one of cultural egalitarianism through implementing a dialogue of civilizations. However, President George W. Bush's designation of Iran as part of the axis of evil abruptly put an end to those efforts. Then we're looking at the 2009 presidential elections and discursive representation of Iran's political system in the West. One of the biggest critiques of Iran is that too often compartmentalizes domestic and foreign politics of IR, The idea that international relations is inherently about external threats, ideas, and actors is counterproductive, particularly for looking at non-Western states. So looking at the Iranian election in that context is really important. That involves looking at a lot of mainstream media and conducting a critical discourse analysis on the framing of the democratic process in Iran. Iran's resistance to Western sanctions regimes during the Ahmadinejad presidency is then explored. A lot of us are obviously quite familiar with Ahmadinejad and staunchly anti-Western. But really in this period, it shows how a resistance narrative is incorporated staunchly into Iranian national interest to the point where it allows its economy to drastically suffer. And that's kind of, again, something that confuses a lot of IR analysts. Sanctions are supposed to be about a cost benefit. If the economy is collapsing, then it's probably not worth the policy that you're pursuing. And then finally ending on a good note in some ways. I mean, the JCPOA is defunct now, unfortunately, but the Iran nuclear deal and the consequences of rhetorical change in diplomacy kind of gives us an idea of sort of how, when these non-Western voices are heard, when the realistic or reasonable elements of Iran's foreign policy are considered, then positive change can be had. So the nuclear deal marks a significant change in Western engagement with Iran, one that recognizes its positional perspective, disposes of reductive rhetoric, and is forced into productive diplomacy. And arguably, this was a win-win for the Iran and the United States, and especially Europe. I think Europe is still annoyed that the JCPOA has fallen apart, especially with what's happening with Russia. And I know I'm running out of time, so I'll very quickly sort of go through the four main outcomes of the study. Again, these aren't sort of definitive conclusions, but essentially Iran's history is ingrained in its foreign policy. It is something that permeates almost every decision that's made by Iranian foreign policymakers. Iranian IR scholarship does reflect a growing desire for more scholarly consideration of itself. It does reflect the very fact that a lot of it is written in English, I think, is illustrative of that. Non-Western perspectives can be a tool at the disposal of all scholars, not just native ones. While more native scholarship is encouraged, non-Western understandings can be enlightening for those outside of the subject matter as well. Obviously, not all, for someone who doesn't speak Farsi, not all of the material is going to be accessible. And that's something that I'm very frank about in the book, that I will be overlooking certain sources. But it also does encourage Iranian scholars to write more. And especially if they're going to be considered in that context and understood in a way that they want to be understood, then that's a positive outcome too. And then finally, an awareness of discursive ideology. So through communication, it really assists in drawing out these marginalized perspectives. So looking at discourse as a referent object in this context is helpful, not just in drawing out those non-Western perspectives, but also being conscious of sort of the position of you as a scholar, where you're sitting, and understanding that too. And also not knowing the language, keeping that in mind. And there are obviously some broader implications, which we're probably going to talk about in the questions. But essentially understanding the burgeoning women's movement in Iran, I think, is going to be really important. This is going to be a really important way of doing that, combined with sort of critical feminist approaches and intersectional feminist approaches. I think that that's a really important field of study, which I'm sure many scholars are working very hard on right as we speak. The changing regional context post-Gaza, I think after October 7th is something that we're really going to have to keep an eye on, and that we're going to have to really, in Iran specifically, have to sort of listen to what's coming out of Iran sincerely and take it seriously. And of course, the sort of ever-changing, in this new regional context, that it's ever-changing relations with its Arab neighbors. I think not just looking at the difference between Iran, the IR approaches of Iran and Western powers, but also looking at the difference between Iran and its Arab neighbors. I think that that's a really important study too, that we should consider. But I might finish my talk there. I think I've talked for quite enough, and I'm looking forward to hearing some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. That was fascinating and incredibly accessible, especially as someone who has not studied IR as much as I would have liked to. I was very glad that I was able to comprehend all of that. Thank you for that. And so for those in the audience, y'all can start sending your questions in now. I'm going to have a few announcements about the project to give Dr. Thomas a couple of minutes to have a short break. but please do share those questions to the Q&A, and we can certainly get to them in just a minute. So the Iran 1400 project, the most important announcement I would say is that we just updated our website, and we have a brand new website that is hopefully very accessible. So please go check that out. There you'll find everything from articles, podcasts, to YouTube videos, and just a variety of things, and it's all in one place. And so please do check that out if you have a moment. Uh, Most recently, um, you can find our most recent podcast, which is coincidentally also with a scholar of Iran from Australia, Dr. Michelle Langford. Her podcast episode is called Allegory in Iranian Cinema and Its Societal Reflections. We have part one of that up, and we'll have part two coming out soon. Also, please do, if you check out our website, you can sign up there to be alerted of upcoming articles and podcasts and whatnot. And additionally, the last thing I'd like to mention is that we will have another Spotlighting an Author event on March 22nd with Katrine Nahidi. It's about her book, The Cultural Politics of Art in Iran: Modernism, Exhibitions, and Art Production. So please stay tuned, and you'll receive an email alert for that. If you're here, we have your email, so you can be updated about all of these things. Like I said, please take a look at our website if you can, and if you want to get involved with the project, there should be a spot for you to be able to reach out to us and let us know what you'd like to see on the project, who you'd like to see, and what topics you think need to be covered. And so, with that being said, we can now get to questions. We already have one in. So, rather than start with my own, just in case we have a lot of questions from the audience, I think I'll go straight into the audience questions. So, our first question is from Sanford Weiner, who asked, how or has Iran's antagonism with the West and Sunni states benefited the Iranian people?
Sanford, that's an excellent question. Thank you. Thank you so much. Um, I think, well, at risk of putting it too bluntly, not much. um, the, I have an article coming out, hopefully quite soon, which talks a lot about this. Some kind of is a different way of looking at my sanctions chapter, and sort of looks at how this Iranian state has used kind of post-colonial narratives to justify a significant resistance of the West. And a lot of the time it is to the detriment of the Iranian people, particularly economically. So, for example, there's one particular anecdote in which Porsche sales in Iran went up by I think it was something like 10 or 12% in the period in which Iran was trying to resist sanctions. So the idea was that the poorest of the poor, the working class, were being hit the hardest, and the elites were still doing just fine. In that period, in the Ahmadinejad period, and even after, the middle class was effectively destroyed for quite a long time, at least. That being said, this is not necessarily saying that it's a direct result of those policies, but the outcome of the JCPOA did quite significantly benefit the Iranian people. Their view of the reformist movement, their view of government was actually improved pretty significantly. And obviously the sanctions relief that brought was according to polling, was quite good. Now, in a lot of other polling that's happened sort of since the collapse of the JCPOA, what we do see is that the Iranian people are capable of being both resentful to their own government and the United States. They're quite capable of sort of understanding that multiple actors, pardon me, multiple actors are actually responsible for our situation, and sort of understanding that the Trump administration scuttling the JCPOA and the regime's response is something that are both responsible. When it comes to Sunni states, I would say the encounters that Iran has had with Sunni states are quite different. A lot of the encounters that it's had have been clandestine in nature, through the Quds Force, through operations in Yemen, through operations in Lebanon and Gaza and Syria. So from that national security perspective, the Iranian government would certainly say that those actions are making the Iranian people safer. But that's kind of like arguing the same thing in a Western country context, where like, oh, does in 1951, did orchestrating a coup in Iran by the West, did that make Americans safer? It's kind of a nebulous sort of question, which doesn't really have a clear answer. So it's hard to sort of pass exactly how lives have been improved by this sort of like policies of resistance that the Iranian government has. It's quite clear that the Iranian people, at least since the last few years, since the JCPOA, are very apathetic with the way that the government is being run. And you'll see, I mean, we're already talking about the early polling from the parliamentary elections today showing that this is a very, very low turnout election. And that usually voter apathy means that they are not very happy with the way that their government is handling things. So possibly not a completely direct answer to your question, but hopefully helpful.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. So the next question is based off of the mission of the Iran 1400 project, which is, of course, to look at the evolution of ideas and institutions. And so with that in mind, I haven't been, because your book's not out yet, I haven't been able to read it yet. But so apologies if this isn't necessarily in your book, if you're focused more on recent studies. But did you see in your research if transitioning from the Pahlavi government to the Islamic Republic government, did you see a change to the theoretical approach to the Iranian government, or was it still very like just a general Western-centric IR theoretical approach to it? Does that make sense?
Yes. So my first chapter is actually a historiography. So it does. I would love to spend more time on the Pahlavi regime, and because I think it particularly it does show that the revolution, as much as part of the discourse of the Western discourse of why that revolution happened is theological, which of course it is, but it was also a very intellectual revolution. It was a lot of university students, a lot of educated people coming out, very in a lot of similar ways to the Bolshevik Revolution, who wanted to create a better society and thought that Islam was the way to do that. I think there's evidence that there was a pretty significant shift in foreign policy, and I think that the difference is that the Pahlavi regime was much more in that, I mean, obviously quite friendly with the West, but much more in that looked at international politics as much more traditional kind of cost benefit of like consolidation of power is obviously a really important thing, but also an attempt to keep those allies as important sort of mainstays of their power, particularly the UK and the United States, and the context and how Reza Pahlavi came back into power, which was at their behest. So understanding understanding that. Also, as we know, Reza Pahlavi was very obsessed with military hardware. He was a big fan of guns and boats and planes and stuff. And the best way to do that was to get that from the United States. And obviously that feeds into that kind of traditional traditional IR analysis of military power is what's important. Now, in some ways, post-revolution, Iran is quite similar to other states in that you can see a kind of big struggle against counter-revolution. And that's something that happens in every post-revolutionary state. Doesn't matter what the ideology is in a lot of cases. But the differences are that obviously it's butting up against quite a lot of its neighbors, in particular Iraq, and those formative years of Iran's of the Islamic Republic's history are fraught with obviously the Iran-Iraq War and also the Iran hostage crisis. So the Iran hostage crisis obviously ran for quite a while, but that is not only important to Iran, but important for the United States in framing Iran. So the difference is that Iran flipped in its position, in its global position, from being sort of alongside being a peer of the United States and the UK, etc., to being a pariah. And that in itself changes foreign policy. Again, this study is not about trying to find similarities everywhere, but I mean, look at Russia. Look at the way that Russia acts in global politics compared to a lot of other states. Because the international system no longer benefits them, they see the rules differently. They see rules such as sovereignty, something that all states, no matter what they believe, are supposed to believe in. Because if I invade you, that means that I can be invaded by anybody. That sets a precedent for me being invaded. So I don't want that. But for Russia, the calculation is different. They're already isolated. They already see that the world is kind of against them, and that's the primary shift that I think Iranian politics had post-revolution. I think that that's a really important shift, at least in a foreign policy context. I know obviously there are the years of the post-revolution are fraught with upheaval and purge and exit from a lot of Iranians as well. So yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. The whole history is, of course, and being able to look at it from this lens is very interesting. For those in the audience, we have time for a couple more questions, so please do send those in. The next question is from Yusuf Azizi, who asks, is it correct that we can see a continuity in foreign policy between the Pahlavi regime and the Islamic Republic regime in Iran in some arena, like advancing in nuclear technology and being a dominant power in the Persian Gulf, as well as sentiment against imperialism, etc.? And then there's a comment, the fact that someone could argue with the end of the Cold War and U.S. independent of the Middle East oil, there would be a good chance that any political regime in Iran would do the same as what the Islamic Republic of Iran did.
Okay, yeah. So great question, great point there. So yeah, and I make the point in the book that non-Western perspectives sometimes align. They're sometimes the same. And quite often, assuming that they're kind of these diametrically opposed, talk about it in the introduction, that looking at the West and the non-West as these kind of geographic, positional, opposed forces is definitely not helpful. So often we see a lot of continuity in that policy. And in terms of nuclear technology and that sort of thing, and as we said, that the Pahlavi regime was big on weapons procurement. There is a that desire is still there, and and this is why I say realism is not an unhelpful approach. Obviously, survival is important to Iran. Obviously, power is important to Iran, um, but it sees power differently. It sees power as as something that can be fostered through means other than traditional means. It's also not just what we would call, I would say, middle power in global politics. So some power that has a little bit of influence, but not enough to throw its weight around like the United States. But in terms of nuclear technology, for example, there are a lot of discourses linking nuclear technology and sort of the technological advancement of the Islamic Republic as being something that's Islamically pious, as something that should be done for reasons of Islam, for all Muslims should want a nuclear Iran, at least during the Ahmadinejad era. And you can see that go away when the JCPOA is signed. So there is, again, you've got to be careful of sort of taking a lot of those narratives seriously about Iranian culture and nationalism, particularly when they come from the state. So the sentiment against imperialism, I think, at least in the Pahlavi regime, the Pahlavi regime focused a lot more on this kind of Persian nationalism and kind of, rather than a resistance against imperialism, it was much more about becoming an imperial power again. Again, with the very famous a celebration of Persian nationalism that sort of was instrumental in the downfall of the Pahlavi regime in the eyes of Iranians, was something that sort of showed that the Iranian regime was that the Pahlavi government was more concerned with these power with the power element of sort of consolidating national identity. And the Islamic Republic do that as well, just through Islam. But the difference is that it actually adopts a much more kind of post-colonial view of imperialism, basically saying that it's any kind of colonial imposition on Iran is something that should take top priority in being resisted. Now, the second part of your statement, the fact that someone could argue with the end of the Cold War and the US independence of the Middle East oil, there could be a good chance that any political regime in Iran would do the same as what the Islamic Republic of Iran did. Yeah, absolutely. And you also see, again, not necessarily revolutions, but you see things like the Suez Crisis, understanding that, looking at Western interference in the region and going, hang on, you actually need this. You actually need this quite a lot. And, we have the power to resist you here. So I would say that is quite important. That is quite important to the Islamic Republic post-revolution as well, in difference to the Pahlavi regime, because the Pahlavi regime benefited quite a lot from that sort of imperial relationship, whereas the Islamic Republic certainly did not.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Those in the audience, we have time for about 2, maybe 3 more questions. So please send them in now. Another question of my own is in your book, you talk about how important it is for folks, academics, just normal people as well, or non-academics, to consider non-Western approaches. And obviously your book is a good resource in that. But what are some other ways for, think tanks, for the government, for people interested in IR? How can we get that message to those sorts of people?
So it's actually quite easy, especially for Iran 1400, because you're already doing it. You're already inviting Iranian academics of all of different from different kinds of political approaches, from state affirming perspectives, with people affirming perspectives, and also mixing that in with, I think, something that this book doesn't do much of, which is mixing in a lot of other disciplines and cultural framings of it as well. So like you said, Sydney, that you had an expert on Iranian dance on, for example, like that. That I think makes it dissolves a little bit of that otherness, which is again a big part of sort of seeing a big problem that we have in international politics of uh, understanding what other cultures are and what their differences are, I guess, and assuming those differences. And I think the Iran 1400 actually is also a great resource for people to come for that. But you also see, I mean, for people at large, for universities, for think tanks, for scholarly institutions, really the best way to do that is to invite native scholars to speak. And another thing I would say is getting works translated. So spending universities, particularly spending money on if a scholar at your university says, "Hey, this is actually a really important text," giving that scholar funding to translate that text, I think is a service, but also it is a service to the field. More importantly, it doesn't just help that scholar; it helps our understanding, of the subject. So that's applicable to any context. But yeah.
Great, thank you. So the next question is hard to ask it. That was a very general question, but now a more specific question. You talked about the effect of sanctions, even just in the introduction of your book that I read. And I thought that it was really interesting, your argument of like, I don't have the text with me, but could you describe your argument about sanctions and how they may or may not have affected Iran's foreign policy and how, that should change someone's IR approach to understanding Iran?
Yeah. So my view of sanctions is actually a little broader. And it's something that actually a lot of scholars hold a view in, and that's that sanctions are actually really problematic in terms of a foreign policy. They often don't work, and they often consolidate. They often are counterproductive. That we have horror stories, obviously, like the oil for food program in Iraq, and just children dying by their hundreds, starving to death. Poorly run sanctions programs can be devastating, not just to people but also to the environment. For anybody who frequently travels to Iran during when sanctions were at their highest, you would have noticed that because Iran was basically converting chemical plants to refine oil, just black smoke everywhere. The octane in the oil was so high that it was burning at a much higher temperature, and black smoke spewing into Tehran. A lot of my friends who come and go from Iran say that they frequently have to wear masks because of the fumes. But the core element is that sanctions are inherently coercive, right? So sanctions are designed to make a state do what they don't want to do. If they wanted to do what you wanted to do, then you wouldn't need sanctions to make them do it. So this is where Iranian resistance comes in, and this resistance narrative about resisting any kind of coercive power, any kind of coercive policy that the West has against them. Going to the extent of taking chemical plants and saying, okay, well, if you're not going to allow these oil companies to sell us parts to maintain or even buy refined oil, but we'll refine it ourselves. We'll do it ourselves. And Khamenei talks about this self-reliance of the Iranian state and building that. Now, that actually ended up consolidating a lot of power in the regime, because what it did was it allowed them to sort of say, well, this is actually a noble effort. This is like, look at what these sanctions are doing to you. We are actually fighting against them. And that in itself, because there's a grain of truth there, because these sanctions are impacting Iranian lives so significantly, then it gave a lot of agency to the Islamic Republic in order to foster this self-reliance narrative, which also consolidated a lot more power in the government, because it allowed them to refine their own oil, for example. But there is a great text. My first academic article that actually drew on this text from a guy called Tim Niblock. He's from the University of Exeter, and he did an analysis in 2001, back in 2001, about how sanctions affected certain Middle Eastern states. And I did my analysis sort of quite a bit later, or more than 10 years later, and very little had changed in terms of the way that sanctions have been applied on Middle Eastern states. In a lot of cases, they did isolate regimes, but they also consolidated power in those regimes. They hurt the population on the ground, and often the policies didn't change, and that's the key part of it. So that brings us to the question of what are sanctions actually for? If they're not about changing policy, then they're about punishment. And part of like I say, hopefully this article on sanctions is coming out soon. It basically illustrates that after the JCPOA, the Obama administration kind of effectively used the sanctions as the stick part of a carrot and stick approach. They continued the Bush era sanctions on Iran, in one case, like significantly increasing their pressure, and then brought Iran to the table and said, okay, let's talk about this. After the JCPOA, when the Trump administration unilaterally pulls out of it and reinstates sanctions, those sanctions now no longer are about policy. Those sanctions are now about isolation and punishment and just distancing Iran from the West. And that's the worst case scenario for sanctions, because what it means is that it gives Iran no choice but to see those sanctions as illegitimate, because they're not getting any relief. They tried, and for people who haven't been following the Iranian nuclear program quite closely, during the JCPOA period, the Joint Chiefs had to report to Congress in the United States every 3 months to say whether or not Iran was abiding by those by the agreement, and not once did they say that they were in breach. So the Joint Chiefs were actually lobbied against the Trump administration from withdrawing from the deal, because they said Iran's abiding by it, it's making America safer. But now we're in the scenario where Iran really doesn't have a choice but to call the bluff, where they have to pursue enrichment, they have to resist sanctions, and they have to align with Russia. It's really that simple. And it's also affected the domestic politics as well, because there was a lot of support, so grassroots support for Rouhani's presidency, but when it all fell apart, he was seen as incompetent. He was seen as someone as just like the rest. And then, of course, we have Ibrahim Raisi come to power with a much stauncher, more communist, more revolutionary view of international relations and their relations with the West. So the sanctions, Iran's relationship. Iran has been, the Islamic Republic, has been under sanctions since its existence, largely since the Iran hostage crisis. So it's very familiar with them. And as a result, it's learnt how to deal with them quite effectively, at least from the position of the regime. The people are different. The people obviously have been struggling ever since.
Mhm. Great, thank you. We just got another question, and do you have time for one more?
Yeah,
It
sure.
Great. All right. Uh, from an anonymous attendee, uh, the person says, this is not a question on Iran specifically, but speaking of Western perspectives, there is also the Marxist, which has been adopted and adapted by non-Western political cultures. What's interesting is that Marxist academics such as Vivek Chibber and Adolf Reed have attacked post-colonialist theory as placing too much weight on the effects of colonialism and not enough on the structural class inequalities of non-Western societies. So, what are the other non-Western perspectives that have been ignored that have explanatory power as opposed to simply being perspectives?
Excellent. Great. So I would actually say, to answer your question, I would say that Marxism and adaptations of Marxism are also quite common in the global South in terms of explaining inequality. And in fact, Vivek, very familiar with Vivek Chibber's work, and they make a really important argument, which is that post-colonialism as an approach has been primarily used in the West, and that's uh, a charge that's true. That's something that is quite common. That a lot of Western academics take post-colonialist perspectives and apply them and assume that that's what people want. But Marxism is kind of is an important perspective, and given that a lot of non-Western academics again had this Western education, that adapting Marxist theory and class struggle into their sort of their local context is important. Also, seeing colonialism as through a Marxist lens as well. So understanding that colonialism is inherently about class and about the stratification of society as well, and that they're the same. Um, there's actually quite a lot of sort of Marxist history, Marxist historical approaches to the Iranian history, and to sort of particularly about the revolution, quite obviously, but also that during the revolution, there was actually quite a lot of hand holding between the Islamists and the Marxists. That the Marxists actually were instrumental in helping the revolution actually happen in the first place, and that's because they saw their goals as aligned. That anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, and kind of anti-exploitation and anti-classism were kind of were not one in the same, but were able to work together for the same goal to overthrow the Shah. So that I think is really important. I'm glad you sort of raised that. Non-Western perspectives. We often assume that any kind of academic. We don't want to assume like I are that these perspectives are homogenous. But I think that Marxism in particular is another really good one when we're drawing out non-Western perspective for sure.
All right. I think that is a good note to end on. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Thomas. For those in the audience, please, if you enjoyed the chat, which I'm sure that you did, please check out Dr. Thomas's book, Iran and the West, A Non-Western Approach to Foreign Policy. I believe pre-orders are available March 12th, and April 2nd is when the book is actually published.
Mhm.
So So please check that out. And that's with Routledge, I believe.
Routledge. Yeah.
Routledge.
So it's available. It's only available in hardcover at the moment in terms of physical copies, but there are digital copies as well. And then uh, down the track there will be a paperback as well. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. So yes, please everyone go keep an eye on that March 12th for the pre-order. And additionally, like I said earlier, we have another Spotlighting an Author event in just a couple weeks, and that is on March 22nd with Katrin Nahidi about her book, The Cultural Politics of Art in Iran, Modernism, Exhibitions, and Art Production. Also, if you found today's event interesting, please do check out our website. We've had a variety of different scholars on talking specifically about foreign policy or IR. Ali Alfoneh, Alex Vatanra, Ali Fatullah Nejad, just to name a few. There's a lot more. So please check out Iran1400.org. And with that being said, I think that's all I have for y'all. Thanks for joining us, and please let us know what you think of the event. Feel free to reach out on our website. And thank you again, Dr. Thomas, for being with us, especially
Thank you,
so
everybody.
early in the morning for you.
No worries at all. Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me. And what a wonderful project. Thank you.